Hello everyone, and welcome to Botany Lab for today. I'm Jonathan Schramm, Professor of Sustainability and Environmental Ed out at Mary Lee, and I'm here today actually with my two kids, Tilly and Eric Schramm, who are bored and wanted to come out and see what botanists talk about in the field. So I hope you're all doing well, enjoying your May term class with the Michelers, and I'm glad to be able to spend some time with you today. We're going to talk a little bit about trees, which are a personal favorite plant of mine. But also some of the patterns we'll talk about with trees are, of course, the things that would affect shorter plants too, herbaceous plants and smaller woody plants like shrubs. But this time of year I always find in the middle of spring here is a great time to think about trees because you can see so much more of their biology happening quickly. And it's fun to watch the changes. So I hope you've been noticing some of these things, and I also hope you'll find out some new things as we talk today. So before we talk about any specific tree, I want you to think about habitats that you're finding trees in. And where are you exactly? So Eric, if you could just sort of do a little panorama around the area here. Show students what kind of forest we're in the midst of. There's Tilly. Okay. So if you're familiar with Goshen, this is a swamp forest that's actually close to the Goshen Middle School, kind of across the river from Shanklin Park. And as you noted, as Eric took a panoramic shot around here, there's some pools of water on the ground, what we might think of as vernal pools that are only present in the springtime. You probably noted the topography was pretty level. It's fairly flat here, but there are small rises, little tiny hills, we call them hummocks, and then hollows that are filled with water. So that hummocks and hollows is kind of a characteristic of flatland forests, like this forest here, which is in the floodplain of the Elkhart River, which is about a quarter mile behind me. And so there are, of course, particular species that do well in this part of the world in lowland forests. So for example, one of them would be silver maples. And Eric, if you could look to your right, show them the tree right here, and then go all slowly up into the canopy. So you can see the leaves are just starting to emerge on the trees here. It depends what species we're talking about. In the case of these silver maples, the leaves are like probably 3 days into their emergence, so very recently. Some of the other species around the floodplain started earlier. But think about some of the things that are likely to characterize the pattern of growth for trees whenever they're in a lowland situation. Because of course, what's important for tree growth and forms, really you can boil it down to a couple of things. It's soils and it's water levels. So as you've already seen by the pools here, there's a lot of water close to the surface of a lowland forest like this. And so therefore trees that live here need to be able to avoid having their roots die by getting too deep into soils that have no oxygen left and then having those cells die. So the trees, no matter how old they are in a swamp forest, often have roots that are very close to the surface. And we'll see if we can find a spot here where we've had a tree blow over and you can see how close those roots are to the surface. Oftentimes, water levels are directly connected to soils. And so if you think about what kind of soils are likely to be present here, they're going to be thick clay soils that are really resistant to water infiltrating down into them, and as compared to sandier soils that are quicker to dry out. If you want to find out more about soils, you could take a whole class with Dr. Michelor in a semester. There's a ton to learn there, but I'm going to quickly just show you a couple of important things to watch for as you're in the field looking around to do this kind of ecology. So here's a little bit of a small soil pit for this swamp forest. And you can tell a lot just by the first touch of a soil. And you'll see obviously roots and other organic materials in the soil. One thing to note is the color. So generally speaking, the darker soil colors are, the more organic matter is involved. And often in places that have had agricultural history, it would reflect a longer time since annual plowing stopped. although that wouldn't have happened here. It's too wet to have been annually farmed here. What you can do, a very simple way to start feeling some of the soils and trying to understand what you're dealing with, is to crush them a little bit between your fingertips and see if you can feel any grittiness from sand. In this case, I'm not feeling very much of that at all, so it's almost very little sand, mostly organic matter, and then in terms of mineral content, probably heavily clay, which again we kind of hypothesized from the wetness of the surroundings here. You can also, if you dig a deeper pit, this is just very shallow, but you can look for zones within the soil that would indicate again how long the soil has been developing in this place. That's just a quick look at that soil. We'll compare it to another couple of soils here in a while. So in addition to thinking about soils and water available for trees, another thing to consider is topography, and specifically what's called aspect. Aspect is essentially what direction a piece of land is facing. And if there is a slope to the landscape, is that slope putting the plants, including trees, facing south, which in the northern hemisphere would mean that they're getting more direct sunlight more of the year and more of each day, or is it facing north, in which case, and again in the northern hemisphere, would mean it's more often indirect light, thus cooler, thus slower to dry out. So topography and slope and aspect in particular have a lot to do with what kind of plants will grow in a place as well. And obviously in a flat land, that's not so much the issue. The slope is very close to zero along a lot of this. So aspect isn't quite so important, but when we see another site here, we'll have a chance to compare there. Another thing I'd like you to be thinking about is this time of year, where, as we started to talk about earlier, where are the trees in their annual cycles of flowering, fruiting, and leafing? And so a lot of the trees in this part of the world are wind-pollinated flowers. They're not very showy. You could miss them without realizing that it was happening. But this time of year in the spring is when you can catch those flowers. So Eric, if you could look up, try to film up in that area up there. Folks, I don't know how well you can see this as you watch on your computer, but as you can see, the different tree species that we're taking a look at up there are sort of at different points in how far emerged their leaves are. From the elms very close to us here that are almost to mature leaf size, to the silver maple that we talked about earlier that just started emerging, to the sycamore tree, which is the white bark far from us there, that hasn't even started to put out leaves yet. But the other structure that's out at the tip of those branches would be the flowers. And it's really difficult to get a look at those unless you can find a low-hanging branch. But again, because they're wind-pollinated, usually it's more beneficial for the tree to produce those in the spring when there's not a lot of leaves to catch the pollen. Instead, there would be only other flowers of its type out there. Would be, of course, the hope for an individual piece of pollen. So Eric, if you could just take a panorama kind of up high through there slowly. And of course, after flowers in the botanical world, there's the development of fruit. And so each of these species has a different kind of fruit. A lot of the trees in a floodplain forest make wind-dispersed seeds. So they're not just wind-pollinated flowers, they also are wind-dispersed seeds. Like the little maple helicopters that you might be familiar with from your childhood. Those are technically called samaras, right? You learned about that last week, I hope. And then other trees in different habitats tend to have fruits that are heavier, and that might just be more of a plop and drop or carried by animals. Picture, for instance, around here, things like acorns from oak trees. So, yeah, that's a quick introduction to what you might start to look at when you find yourself blindfolded and then suddenly the blindfold is off and you're in the middle of a forest. How can you orient yourself to what you're seeing around here? So go ahead and work on the first activity that you have in your lab sheet, and then I'll see you again in a little bit for one more video as we compare this lowland forest to a different habitat. Thanks.